Hello, and welcome to Module 6. This module is on planning for instruction and assessment in the dual language classrooms. And I used some of the slides from Dr. Proctor's module on assessment, and I created the first part. So the objectives will be for participants to demonstrate understanding of bilingual education case studies, highlighting successes and challenges. And this will be done mostly through your reading. And then also how to organize a general curriculum and instruction in a dual language program. And finally, to demonstrate understanding on issues of assessment with bilingual children at the classroom level, mostly, somewhat in the school district and somewhat at the state level. So this course is about foundations of bilingual education. And when we think about foundation, as this image suggests, we talk about background, understanding the history, which we did in Module 1. We talk about models and program structure in general. So we did that in Module 2. Then in Module 3, we did policies and law, which is almost like a foundational framework for what we would do. In Module 4, we talked about 4 and 5, we talked about the philosophy and the drive and the responsive pedagogy in dual language education and bilingual education. And now in Module 6, we're going to talk about curriculum and instruction and assessments. And this is where the guiding principles for dual language education gets us started. So it actually starts with program structure, but then it goes into curriculum and instruction. So we target curriculum once we have determined who are our participants, what is the purpose of our program, who will be the government or the people in charge, and then determine the model as well. Is it going to be a 50-50 or a 90-10, going into a 50-50? Is it going to be with one teacher or two teachers, etc.? So when we talk about curriculum, we pay attention to the 3 principles that the guiding principles of dual language education proposes, the cover that I just showed to you. And we will see that what's common in all the sections of the book is that we need to attain to the 3 goals of dual language education, and that we need to use technology. But what's unique about the principles of curriculum is the emphasis on using standards-based curriculum. So when we talk about standards-based, we think of mapping the curriculum based on standards for the different disciplines or subjects. So we take a look at the standards, we determine the units that could cover those standards with specific themes and learning objectives. And then, of course, the standards and the learning objectives for each of the lessons of those units. And finally, within each lesson, we consider what is it that we're going to cover specifically and what are the learning objectives for that lesson. So this is all that standard-based curriculum planning implies. So this is an example from BGLAD, and we will have, some of you have had the training already, but others or the rest of the network will have the training at the end of June. It's a virtual two-day academy, and they propose something like this for their thematic standard-based planning. So this is their integrated year map, and they first look into the standards for each discipline. They map them out by discipline, and then they include in the left column, the specific units. So they do thematic instruction. So a unit will include a theme, a main theme, and that theme will be carried on throughout the subjects. And to do that, they have the teachers work with the specific standards here in different colors, depending on the discipline, having clear what the resources will be and their timeline. Then they spread out the different standards throughout the units. And as you can see, making no distinction of what disciplines they come from, as long as they can cover them within each of the units. This is another view of what it looks like once it's done, with the units on the left column, the timeline, and then the specific standards by content area, including literacy. And then, since we also propose not only thematic instruction, but also project-based learning, because both of them are research-based, To do a project-based learning, you take one of your units and you look at the main components of that unit. In this case, the unit is the cycle of life. So the different components proposed are the offspring and birth, the growth, inherited traits, variation of traits, and then environmental influences. So in order to turn this into a project-based unit, you assigned a specific cycle of life for a group of students that will do the research, and then they have to find facts within each of the components of the units. And this is done after you know that this targets a standard. So in this case, the standard might be understand the components, the main components of a cycle of life, including the moment of initiation and the main elements of growth or something like that. So when it comes to instruction, once we have our curriculum map, we can zoom into the instructional piece. And we pay particular attention to the language and literacy development, since many times this is a difficult thing to align into language education when the teachers don't have yet the experience to do it. So we see that the principles that the guiding principles of dual language education propose are 5, and 2 of them are the same: to follow the core goals of dual language and to include technology. But then there's 2 specific principles. One is to always use research-based instructional strategies, and the other one is to have your instruction be student-centered. And many times we read this student-centered and we think it's only to differentiate and adapt to the student. But it has a lot to do with the way we structure our literacy, because if we consider that the student is at the center, then we have to rule out of all the linear models where we go into the decoding through phonics and the blending and the syntax and the specific vocabulary and then the reading and then the writing, because that is a fictional way of looking at literacy. It's not student-centered. When it's student-centered, you look at the student, you look at the interest and sources of engagement, you look at a theme that's interesting, you look at a reading piece that it's at the grade level, and you, or a little bit above grade level if it's going to be guided, and then you introduce that text, you expand the knowledge, and then within that text, that's when you draw then the phonics, the decoding piece, the syntax understanding, the language connections, and you go back and forth from each of these areas of literacy development back to the student, always to keep that engagement piece, and also to always to teach all the different components of literacy within the context of the theme that's interesting to the student. And I didn't say much about it because this is just like an appetizer. And 2 of the courses that come after this course as part of the certificate will go deeply into that. So if you take a look at the principles side by side, what's unique about the curriculum is that it has to be standard-based. So it's a must. And what's unique about instruction is that it has to be, instructional methods are derived from research-based principles. So what we do is research-based, and that is student-centered. So when we think about what is research-based and what it's not, it can be complex. So for example, there's some aspects that are research-based, and this actually, the left side of this slide is from Big Lad, and I omitted giving them credit, I apologize. So they're saying there's a specific information we have from the science of reading that's research-based, and we have a lot of it now with neuroscience. So they're proposing there is language development and literacy development when it's encountered in context, something that I explained briefly. Teach language through cognitively complex academic content, so never language in isolation. So we don't teach language, we teach through language. And what we teach is always relevant and complex to make it interesting. And students' culture and language is valued and primary language is encouraged or fundamental in our case, and the need for a low affective filter. So this is, as we know from Krashen, is key. The lower the affective filter, that is the less stress and the more joyful and the more welcoming the student feels, the more the student can learn. And language is acquired and not learned. And this is crucial to counter or to oppose the theory that, or the proponents of the immersion, the sink or swim, the swim or sink proponents. So they believe that you can just learn the language by being exposed to it, but research has shown that it needs to be acquired, explicitly taught. The reason why this can be confusing for some proponents of the immersion model is because approximately 10 to 20% of the population, actually, it's been seen that are somehow linguistically wired to be able to capture the connections of the languages more independently, but it's not the case in research with the majority of the population. So it has to be explicit. Now, there's still some unknown facts in research. So we know that cross-linguistic connections, the explicit connections between the different languages are essential, but we don't know exactly how does respecting language spaces affect the learning. So if we separate the languages, if we connect them only through the bridge, to what extent do they have to be connected to have the same results? We don't know, for example, we know that culturally relevant materials are essential, but we don't know what exactly that culturally relevant means in terms of literacy efficiency. So is it culturally relevant at the level of my own personal identity or my group identity or my more universal identity? So there's a lot of still unknowns about that. And another area is, when do ELs need to begin English phonics? So there's proponents that English learners, emergent bilinguals, there's no reason to delay English phonics. So as soon as you start with the English literacy, Spanish literacy, you should start with English literacy. And there's others who believe, well, research says that as long as our L1 is strong, L2 will come. So why not just do L1 and we'll do L2 later? So there's research that shows that both ways could be effective, and there's still more to be understood in this area. I personally, from my experience, I'm a proponent that if the students are from low income, if the both parents are working parents, if they're English learners, if they've not been exposed to the same standard academic vocabulary as most of the students, that it's better to start in a 50-50 model instead of delaying English. But there's others that would oppose that. So that's still in the process of being researched more deeply and thoroughly. And then also the question of, is it better to use the literacy squared or the teaching for biliteracy format to plan literacy? And we'll talk about what those two formats entail in the literacy instruction. And there's much more. So there's things that we know for sure. There's things that are unknown, and there's things I'm sure that will continue to expand as we move forward with research. So this is one of the things we know for sure. This is Scarborough's rope of literacy, and this is what the science of reading proposes. So it's a very common foundation for all students, and we don't disregard this for bilingual learners. So there is a need for word recognition as well as language comprehension for skilled reading. And we'll talk more about this in the second course that's coming. However, those of us who do research with bilinguals and read bilingual research understand that there's other elements that we need to take under consideration when we analyze literacy from this more fundamental or simplistic way. And that will come later. A very specific aspect is that it has to be within context and not linearly, but with the student centered in a more circular form. So we will once again go deeper into that. And I will upload as a resource this conference that I gave on integrating research and practice when it comes to literacy development for bilingual learners. So there's also specific skills that are concrete for the classroom for developing language, and we will cover them in our GLAD training in June. So this is what I was mentioning about the different proponents of language allocation in literacy and in the rest of the instruction. So for example, Kathy Escamilla and her team wrote by Literacy from the Start. They have a model called, or program called Literacy Squared, and they have great research on how it is effective. And Beeman and Uru as well, they have research on how this can be effective, and it's called Teaching for Biliteracy. So In the literacy square format, they propose to use one bilingual teacher, and they work mostly with one language population, but it can be two as well. And they plan the transfer from one language into another within a block. So they might start the block in Spanish instruction, for example, have a bridge at the end of the, almost at the end of the block, and then moving to, after the bridge, connecting both languages and terms to the other language. So as an example, I observed one of their classes once in Colorado where they had, the second grade teacher was teaching in Spanish the syntax of the structure of the sentence. And after he finished that, he went into the bridge. He talked about all the cognates that we find in syntax, sujeto, adverbio, verbo, artículo. And then he went into the English understanding of or the sentence structure in English. And then the students had the task to look at it side by side and in groups determine what were the similarities and differences. So it could be very effective to do it that way, so that he used both English and Spanish within the same block, and he allowed the students to use either language as they were negotiating. The the teaching for biliteracy is usually for two different populations with two different teachers in a 50-50 model, and they propose that the units, you allocate the language within the unit, the big scope of the unit. So you might start the unit, which is typically 3 weeks, and maybe by the end of the second week, after you do some of the main tasks, the heavy part of the unit, you do a bridge, and then you, after the bridge, you can switch into the second language with another task of the unit. And then simultaneously, that's, for example, for literacy, simultaneously, maybe you're choosing a science lesson and you're starting with the alternative language, so that ultimately every day you're still using both languages almost equally. And then when you finish, for example, the literacy lesson, you begin again the heavy part of another unit with the language that you used at the end of the previous lesson, and then you do the heavy part with that second language or with that language. So in this case, it would be, for example, if I start in Spanish a reading analysis of a text of an argumentative narration about something, an ecological situation, and I take apart the text and I practice putting some ideas together based on the text, and then I research the text, and then I do all that in Spanish, and then I finish 2 big chunks, which was a research and the text analysis, for example, and then you do the bridge. So you make sure you enlist all the new terminology that you used, the students, and you figure it out in English, and then you move into the last part, which might be like a writing piece or something with the same theme as part of the same unit, but in English. And then when you start in the next literacy lesson unit, you start it in English, and then you do the bridge and you finish it in Spanish. So that's just a different format. They also have good results in their research. So it all just leads to see how it might be, both can be effective depending on the rest of the structure of your curriculum, your teachers, and your students. So as I mentioned, there will be 2 more courses that talk about literacy development. You see it right there. And when writing as well, though with writing, I will incorporate a little bit of writing and literacy as well, because more and more research has shown that reading should not be taught independently from writing, since the brain doesn't work that way. So and also in the second course, the one we start at the end of February, there will be a big component on second language acquisition. So we'll talk about the theories for second language acquisition and the applications in the classroom with specific strategies. So I think that will complement what we just explained in this module. So finally, with assessments for bilingual learners, it's not enough to adapt the curriculum and the instruction. We also need to adapt the assessments. And there's typically 3 frameworks, and schools usually and teachers use the framework depending on their own understanding of what bilingualism is. And we see here funny images of, is it, do I think with in the left side, I think in English, and the right side, I think in Spanish? So neuroscience has led us to see that it's not that way, that we use all the same parts of the brain, and that is more intricate when you're bilingual because you're making more connections. But other than that, you're still recycling from the same parts of the brain that are wired for communication and for symbols. Because as you know, our brain, and if you go into my conference that I will upload, you'll see that our brain was wired for oral communication, but was not wired for written communication. So we've recycled the area of symbols and symbol interpretation for that. So within each frame, we're going to talk about, just give a brief description of the framework, and then look into some questions that we can ask ourselves and problems with each one. So the first framework is the idea of how the bilingual is two monolingual students in one. And this is have been highly criticized by most scholars because with the research that we've been able to collect, we see that this is not the case, and there's many problems with this model. But in general, there's this perception that if you just assess in English, you know how well you are in your language skills and your concept development and in anything else. And if you prefer to assess only in the other language, that is the same thing, that you can tell how your skills are in that language, the concept, and so on. And the problem that this framework presents is that it doesn't represent the student's linguistic repertoire. So we don't really, bilinguals don't really process things that way. We're not two monolinguals in we're one unit, thinking and processing language. So another difficulty is that this is a model that the most common model, we default into this model because that's how the structures are. Not only the content of the curriculum usually is defined by the way we've been doing it with standards that are Western European, that we've and the language and the themes standardized by a dominant population. So all this presents a problem if we go by this framework. Then also the assessments do not exist in every language. So when we want to get an idea of the other monolingual within the person, we usually have that issue that we cannot really get the information on that second monolingual in the person. So the second framework is, it's closer to what we're finding out through research in neuroscience. It's called the Common Underlying Proficiency Framework. So in the Common Underlying Proficiency Network, and it's supported by many linguists. Cummins was one of them, though, as you can see, this is from 1980, so it's been evolving as we find out how the brain works. This implies that there's a common underlying proficiency in concepts and understandings of language in general, and then that you can know what's in there in the common understandings based on the languages as you assess in different languages. So this framework is a bit more accurate with the reality of this bilingual, comprehensive repertoire of linguistic background and understandings. But and as you can see here, they would test first in English and then in Spanish and get two different raw scores. And then the student would get two different scores. Here, let me move this. Yeah, so that's exactly it. So the problem with this framework is that there's no indicator of bilingualism and biliteracy. So you get two different scores, and this is a problem if you look at the fact that maybe combined, you could get a better score, and we've seen that through research. So that we will see through the third framework, which is a cross-linguistic framework. And this is the one that most scholars now are standing by because it matches what we've been discovering through neuroscience. And we are learning that it's better to see bilinguals as a linguistic whole. So when we assess letting students and fostering the use of a whole linguistic repertoire. So there's, from a developmental perspective, unbalanced bilinguals pull from the domain language to make sense of the new language, so it's more accurate. And also it's more balanced bilinguals, engage full linguistic repertoires. So when the student knows that he's able to use both languages, then they are engaged completely. Otherwise, they have to be sorting out in their head and they are not really showing how much they know. And actually, in this regards, I just want to mention, I'll cover that later, but it's a great example of how being bilingual it's a real advantage, but it could be really misunderstood when it comes to assessment. There was a research done, and it was concluded that bilingual learners, not only the English learners, but all bilingual learners, needed more time with the multiple choice quizzes, because there's more terminology we're sorting out. So for example, there was a research with a Russian student where the word marker, he was bilingual Russian English, and the word marker in English is something to write with, as you know, but in Russian is a stamp. So when he was choosing the answers, he was eliminating everything that had nothing to do with writing or communication, and everything that had nothing to do with postal service. So it was taking longer until finally, within context, he knew it was a marker and he was able to discriminate everything else. So this is just an example of how having two linguistic or a holistic linguistic repertoire implies having more aspects to consider when your mind is processing. And it's nothing negative when it comes to the intellectual ability and capacities. On the contrary, it develops plasticity because you're constantly juggling more agilely different alternatives. And I can give you many examples of research, but there's another one that I love about a child who had a researcher who was asking for a banana to the participants, and she got two bananas on her desk, one behind the laptop and then the other one on the other side of the desk. And all the students were sitting right on behind the laptop as well. So when she would ask the monolinguals to pass her the banana, the monolinguals just would reach out the banana that was closer to them, which is the banana the teacher couldn't see because it was behind the laptop. But when she would ask the bilinguals to pass her a banana, all the bilinguals would pass her the banana that she could see, even though it was the banana that was farther away from them. And these were preschool age children. So once again, it just shows that there's many advantages, but in that moment, the student did have to make a decision, and maybe it took a fraction longer to really think, okay, she must be referring to this banana because it's the one she can see. So they were immediately connecting to her perspective, not only to their perspective. So these are things that in assessment, we always have to keep in mind. So the problems with this framework, even though it's the one that most of us are inclined to use now that we have the research, is that it's difficult to assess because either you need the right assessments or that you need the experience to be able to allow for both repertoires. And there will be more about this when we go into literacy, because there's a way, and actually I'll give you an example of how there's a way to do it. And also it's at odds with monolingual instructional principles and many, I wrote here dual language schools, but it's really more than anything, just standardized ways of doing, normal things or things that we consider normal for centuries. So this is an assessment that I used to use for incoming kindergartners in our dual language programs in New York. And it's a typical, you can purchase this exam, it's a dial exam from Pearson, and it comes in Spanish and English. So it assesses 4 areas, as you can see: motor skills, actually 3 areas: motor skills, concepts, and language. And it has 10 items. And the yellow is the motor skills, the blue is the concepts, and the green is the languages. So we would, have both the Spanish and the English test with us. And when it came to the motor skills, we will give the directions in both languages so that the student so we could measure with give one score to the student depending on the motor skill, we would discard if he had understood or not. We would do the same for the concepts, so that at the end, if he got it right, it didn't matter in what language, if he got it right, we would give him the full credit for the concepts. And then when it came to the language, we actually did the test in both languages simultaneously and see what language they would respond. So for example, what items do you need, or what will you take with you if it was raining and there's different items on the desk, I mean on the drawn in the test, and the student would start picking them and saying their name, and I would say, oh yes, umbrella. I wonder how you say that in Spanish. Do you know how to say it? And he would say, yeah, paraguas. So I would give him credit for both. So it was a very natural way of having a record of what they could perform in what language, or many times in both, to see how simultaneously or how emergent bilingual they were. And this was just orally, of course, because they were incoming kindergartners, but you can do that as well in the subsequent grades in reading and writing. So you get 1 score for the concepts, for the motor skills, and for everything else that's not language, but you get 2 specific scores for language, and then you assess not the concept, but the language. So in the case of, once again, assessments that match English and Spanish, and there's problems with these assessments because they are not always culturally relevant. So I'm just bypassing all that because it's very hard to get a perfect assessment. But if you have an assessment that mimics English and Spanish, as the EDL and the DRA, which is another Pearson assessment, Kathy Escamilla, she proposes in Literacy Squared to use a validator reading zone instead of a benchmark. So if a student can score, for example, instead of saying he has to be at a 16 by the end of kindergarten, we would say he has, or I think it was, yeah, 16. We would say he has to be between 12 and 16 in Spanish and 8 and 10 in English. Or if it's for most of her classes, because for her groups, because they were Spanish dominant, or you can also do it the other way around if they're English dominant in general. So in that way, you see if they're in the zone more than if they're meeting a specific benchmark, and you don't worry too much if they're not as high in both. So in other words, if you're at a grade level in one language, not at the other grade level in the other one, it's not alarming. Don't pull out the kid for tons of intervention, just keep the course. The same if it's the other way around. And if this is where most of the kids are in that grade, and your student was bilingual, is just a slightly under, but it's in both languages, then it's okay, because it means that it's able to do the cross-linguistic connection, which is already a very high skill. So you just wait and keep the course. If it drops significantly in both, then of course that's where the intervention should always take place to make sure that it's always within the zone. So with this, we conclude module 6. This is the last assessment, and it's a group submission. You can choose to submit one of the following that you have used in your classroom. So you can talk to your group and determine what you want to do. It can be a unit plan with a language allocation, or it can be a content area lesson plan. And actually this book has some, no, it's not this one, sorry. This one has some unit examples with, for elementary school of literacy with different language allocation. It could be a content area lesson plan as well, or it can be an assessment. So first in your group or individually, you choose a lesson plan or an assessment or a unit plan. You upload it into the assignment page. And then the second upload is for a document. It says 1,000 words max, or 4 double space pages, or a video, not too long, recorded in group as a group presentation that addresses the following questions. So you can read those 4 questions, and I'm sure you will do really well. Let me know if you need anything. So with this, you will have concluded Foundations of Bilingual and Language Education. Congratulations. And the next course will start on February 28th. Make sure you're to register, please. And it's on bilingualism, second language acquisition, and literacy development. It's been a pleasure. This concludes the first course. Congratulations.